Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Asia Society and the Asia Society Policy Institute. My name is Filip Ivanov. I'm the CEO of Asia Society Australia. And welcome to today's special event on Southeast Asia and the COVID-19. Before we begin, Asia Society acknowledges that many participants in today's event are dialing in from locations that have traditional owners and custodians. Today I'm speaking to you from Melbourne, from the land of Boon Wurrung and Wurundjeri people of the East Kulin Nation, and I acknowledge the traditional owners of this land and pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I would also like to welcome and acknowledge any Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander or First Nations people joining our webcast today. Over the past year, the Asia Society Policy Institute and Asia Society Australia worked on a project on Southeast Asia and the COVID-19 to examine the various ways the pandemic is affecting Southeast Asia. Over the course of this project, we looked at the pandemic's effect on Southeast Asia's politics and society, its economy, its regional cohesion, as well as its external relations through essays and video commentaries from experts. You can access this latest analysis and the overall project on our website using the link in the chat box that our team is sharing with you now. So today we bring you this panel discussion to examine Southeast Asia's economic prospects as the new COVID variants take hold, the race to vaccinate the region rolls on, and of course the ongoing economic impact of COVID-19 is becoming more apparent. This event, of course, is very relevant today, and we see how the region battles the Delta variant. Unfortunately, the new wave will not only have tremendous health consequences, its impact on the economy, its impact on politics will also be very significant. And of course, above all, the current wave has tremendous human cost. So to all our Southeast Asian viewers and listeners today, from all of us at Asia Society and from Australia, our hearts go out to you. Very special welcome and thank you to the Australia-ASEAN Council and the Victorian Government for supporting this project and for supporting Asia Society Australia. So before we get into today's discussion, let me go through the usual housekeeping. We'll have a 30-minute panel. We'll then move to Q&A, so we very much encourage you to have your questions and comments ready. Please submit them via the Q&A function box at the time, and we'll do our best to answer all these questions throughout this session. It's now my great pleasure to introduce today's speakers. First of all, Huong Le Thu. Huong is a friend of Asia Society and senior analyst of the Australia Strategic Policy Institute at its Defence and Strategy program, where she leads projects on Southeast Asia security and foreign policy. She's also a non-resident fellow at Center for Strategic and International Studies at Washington, D.C. Jayant Menon is a visiting senior fellow at the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, where he works on trade and investment issues and economic development in Asia. And previously he was at ADB as a lead economist in the Office of Chief Economist. Richard Maude is our Executive Director for Policy, as well as Senior Fellow at the Asia Society Policy Institute and the main convener and author of Southeast Asia and COVID-19 project. He's a former senior Australian government official, previously as Deputy Secretary of Foreign Affairs, and also the author of the 2017 Foreign Policy White Paper. Our conversation today will be moderated by Emma Connors, who is a Southeast Asia correspondent for the Australian Financial Review. For those of you that read in the paper, you would have seen Emma's recent articles on the COVID-19 crisis in Southeast Asia. So we're very pleased to have Emma join in our session today. So welcome everyone. Thanks again for participating. And for a full view of the expertise of our speakers, click on the link in the comment box. And Emma, over to you.
Thanks very much, Philip, and welcome everyone. We don't have much time, so And it's a big topic, so we'll just jump straight in. Richard, perhaps if you could start by just giving us sort of a brief overview on the path of the pandemic in Southeast Asia, especially the recent sharp surges we've seen in these countries.
Yeah, thanks, Emma. And of course, just want to recognise that you're in the region, so you have a very direct window on this, of course, yourself, which, as Philip said, reflected in your excellent reporting. But the story now across nearly all the region is definitely one of these surges driven predominantly by the Delta variant. Some of those surges are very large, especially in Indonesia, and large not just in regional terms, but globally. Some are much smaller but persistent and are defeating even the best efforts, for example, of a very effective government like Singapore's to really shut them down. You can see on the chart really the steepness of the curve in which infections have risen in this surge. Indonesia well and truly leads the pack in the rolling average of daily new cases. It's topped 50,000 daily new cases over the past week or so. In Malaysia, new cases are topping the 11,000 mark, but if we did that graph on a per capita basis, Malaysia would actually be ahead of Indonesia. It's a striking figure given its much smaller population. And then you can see the way in which Thailand and Malaysia and Vietnam, etc., are also grappling with their own surges. And we also just have to bear in mind the limitations of the data here. I mean, in Indonesia, we're dealing with official statistics that are not actually capturing the of infections. And so actual cases are going to be substantially higher than those official figures. Hard to know how much higher. Some epidemiologists say at least 4 times higher than the official record. And the same data limitations apply in some other parts of Southeast Asia, including Myanmar, which I know we're going to come back to later on and deal with it. As Philip said, the human toll is immense. I'm sure our viewers will have a sense of that. Many people dying, and especially in Indonesia and Myanmar, many people dying really quite awful, lonely and painful deaths, not being able to access hospital, not being able to access oxygen despite frantic efforts by their families to help them. Once again, we're seeing frontline health workers dying, even the vaccinated. And then on top of this, of course, is the immense economic pain that comes with the rolling restrictions and lockdowns, especially for those, the poorest in these societies, who really can't afford to isolate. It's a big region, so we have to be a little bit careful about generalising, but clearly for the worst affected populations in Southeast Asia, it's really quite a desperate situation. And it might be, I think, best summed up by a story out of Jakarta that Indonesians have taken the initials of the government's lockdown program, which is PPKM, and given it a rather grim new meaning, which in Indonesian is Pelan-pelan kita mati, which you could translate as slowly we all die. So pretty grim. If I could find at least just one hopeful thing to say, Southeast Asians are quite good at looking after themselves when governments can't. So we do see some positive stories of communities rallying, but it is really hard.
Yeah, it certainly is. There's a lot of people who are having a very difficult time at the minute, but perhaps if we could sort of helicopter up, and if I could ask Jay, you know, at the beginning of the year, the region was looking like it was going to come out of the pandemic-induced recession from last year. You know, we were seeing some pretty positive signs. Certainly Indonesia was hoping for 5% growth this year, so sort of getting vaguely back to its historical average. What do you see happening now in terms of the economic recovery or the economy generally for Southeast Asia this year?
Right. Thanks, Emma. And it's nice to be with you and everyone else here today. Yeah, so I think, well, what do we know for sure? Because there are lots of things that we can't be sure about at the moment because of this Delta variant in particular, because, you know, it's evolving in difficult ways that makes it hard to understand its spread, let alone predict its impacts. But what we do know, I think, is that the bottom was hit in the second quarter of 2020. And that's mainly because of how governments responded initially when the pandemic started. There was very little that we knew about this virus then. And so we had general lockdowns across this region by and large, except maybe for Indonesia. So the economic impacts were, devastating. So we had the bottom hit. I don't think we'll retest the bottom. The question is, how's the recovery progressing? As I said, Delta has thrown a spanner in the works in terms of how governments respond. I think there's been some learning by doing. Apart from Malaysia and Singapore, we have not returned to general lockdowns. Singapore today has started the same lockdown it had 1.5 years ago. And Malaysia's had it for a while because, as Richard said, their infection rate adjusted for population is even worse than India at its peak. It's the worst we've seen. So the response this time around hasn't been as drastic from governments. It's been more targeted rather than general lockdowns, except for the 2 cases I mentioned. And so the economic impacts are likely to be less devastating. Second, I think we've also learned how to live with these restrictions, right? We've adjusted and we've been able to cope a bit better when it comes to minimizing or mitigating the economic fallout. So all of this comes back to, I think, the fact that recovery will not be as strong as we thought, say, 2-3 months ago, but it's not been derailed. The IMF's numbers, if they were to redo them today, I think would be downgraded significantly, but not a complete overhaul in terms of being on the recovery path, rather a bit more of uncertainty about the pattern of recovery, not V-shaped, maybe something a bit smoother, a bit more prolonged, with the final caveat that we don't know how this is going to evolve going forward.
I guess we always need to remember that when we're talking about the economy, we're talking about jobs, right? And we're talking about income. And certainly economic growth has been what has pulled so many people out of poverty across the region. So, it's a very real human issue, economic and GDP growth. Always good to ground it. Well, can I ask you, we saw on the weekend there were some protests in Bangkok about the government's handling of COVID-19. And certainly we've seen in Jakarta there has been certainly differences of opinion about how and what's the government's actions and whether they've been adequate or whether indeed they have been too harsh. Do you think that these sort of signs of unhappiness with what governments are doing will have any sort of significant political implications, perhaps once the health crisis is over?
Yeah, I think the Delta variant, this wave of pandemic, is very serious and very dangerous for the reasons that both Richard and Jay have explained, but also has further political implications because, for sure, the region as well as the whole world, I think, that suffers from the pandemic fatigue. People are probably less willing to comply to lockdowns and restrictions because simply, as you say, it's very material needs that would push many of them, want to revive their economic activities. And this looks like a long and, long battle of a pandemic, a long shadow, and increasly societies have doubts and also insecurities and anxieties about how their governments are dealing with that. And this was sparked by second wave, sort of not only capping the number of infection, but now more so in terms of vaccine rollout. And Southeast Asia except for Singapore, has been relatively slow in vaccine rollout. And if we compare with the rest of the world, it's a big gap. The developed world has, around 40 and over 40%, whereas on average in Southeast Asia is around 9-10%, which is really, really low for this group. And that means that, coming back to so normalcy, or what we want to call it, it's going to be slower, protracted. That invokes a lot of anxiety, including economics, but also in some areas already we hear about food shortages and other human security challenges. And I think even countries that have had relatively strong support in the first year of the pandemic are having, now a harder time to convince their people and have their confidence. You mentioned Thai protests, but also, for example, support for Indonesian President Jokowi is really low at this time. He had been doing relatively well for last year, despite how he handled the pandemic. But I think there is a growing sense of mishandling in Indonesia. There's continuous criticism about his unwillingness for strict lockdown measures and not rolling out even better testing mechanism, let alone insufficient vaccines. So there's a lot of unsatisfaction going on, even in Vietnam, who last year was one of the best performers in the region and had one, I think, second in terms of global level of satisfaction in their government's response, is now also quite unhappy about slow vaccine rollout. But the instabilities and pandemics together are a deadly mix, right? We don't want to see people protesting in mass numbers right now when we don't have fully vaccinated population or highly numbers of vaccinated population, and when the Delta variant is so contagious. So I think there are ongoing structural weaknesses in a number of Southeast Asian governments, including Malaysia, but also Philippines, this crisis will only expose the political weaknesses and perhaps also give opportunities for contending forces to exploit that. So we are in a very rough time and rough ride ahead, and I think a lot of those current leaders' legacies will be how they handle the pandemic.
Yeah, well, certainly in the Philippines, in the run-up to the next election there, but you spoke about the intermix between vaccination rates and political goodwill or otherwise towards leaders. And I think, Richard, you had a really good slide that shows those vaccination rates across Southeast Asia.
Yeah, so I think other than Singapore and to some extent Cambodia, you can see there that vaccination rates as a percentage of populations in Southeast Asia are still very low. And they're too low for vaccines to be the answer to the crisis that we're seeing right now. Obviously, in the medium to long term, governments hope they will be the answer, but right now they're not, and that's why we're seeing these rolling restrictions and lockdown measures. So why are vaccination rates low? Well, there's a bunch of reasons, and we don't have time to go through them all, but there's a couple of big ones. One is wealthy countries monopolised vaccines, especially last year, and that meant that especially for the developing countries and the poorer countries, they've just found it hard to get the supplies they needed. I think a second reason is that many Southeast Asian governments were slow off the mark in trying to procure vaccines, perhaps lulled by the successes they had in 2020. And then there are a few other factors that are worth mentioning. Vaccine hesitancy is definitely a problem in many Southeast Asian countries. There's a lot of misinformation out there in Southeast Asia about the vaccines, the COVID vaccines. Some of that's homegrown, but there's also a lot of the anti-vaxxer nuttiness, if I can call it that, from the West being fed into Southeast Asia. And of course, in some countries, the sort of administrative capacity to really go hard at vaccines is lacking. Look, I think that will change, I think, over time. All Southeast Asian governments now have got the bit between their teeth. They're all working really hard to ramp up their programs because they know it's important. And the supply story is going to change. It's already starting to change. The wealthy countries have more excess supply, so they're shipping more into the region. We've got new vaccines that are going to come online. Global production is rising, and also Southeast Asia is beginning to produce vaccines itself. So AstraZeneca, for example, is now being produced under license in Thailand, and Vietnam has just produced its first batch of Russia's so-called Sputnik 5 vaccine. So we are going to slowly overcome the supply challenge, but I think, look, just to conclude, it's really hard to overemphasize what a monumental challenge this is, particularly for the biggest Southeast Asian countries like Indonesia, and also for the poorest of them, to get large percentages of their populations vaccinated, and then presumably to have to keep doing it through booster shots. And a last quick point on vaccines, which is just another complication, I think. Some countries like Indonesia bet very big and early on the Chinese vaccines Sinopharm and Sinovac, and that was a perfectly sensible thing for them to do at the time, particularly because they were the only vaccines available. And these are well-made, safe vaccines that don't need ultra-cold storage, but it does look like they are less effective against the Delta variant. And so what we're seeing is a few Southeast Asian countries now talking about mixing up vaccines. So Thailand is talking about giving people who've had a first dose of Sinovac an AstraZeneca vaccine, for example, for a second vaccine. And we're also seeing booster shots of the mRNA vaccines now being given to Indonesian medical workers who've been fully vaccinated with Sinovac, but as an added precaution are now going to get a third shot, this time of Moderna.
Yeah, and the source of that Moderna is interesting too, right? Because it's coming from the States. So now we've also got the interesting geopolitical scenario playing out. Well, can I just ask you about the vaccine diplomacy? Richard spoke about how China was very quick to work out supply with Indonesia and other countries for its vaccines. And certainly we did see a lot of, China is here for you type talk last year to those countries in relation to vaccines. Now we seem to be hearing some of that talk from President Joe Biden as well.
Yeah, I think in the essay I've written for this project that Richard is leading and Philip has introduced in the beginning, I said that pandemic, instead of making countries to cooperate and through multilateral framework, is becoming more so of a vector of great power competition. And sure enough, the vaccine politics and vaccine diplomacy that you are referring to have already showcase that, and really the mainstream discussion about vaccines and vaccine diplomacy is really about competition, whether it's coming from China or other countries, and what would that mean. In the beginning of pandemic, I was following China's medical assistance to the region, and it was very clear. It was making appearances in Indonesia, Cambodia, Malaysia, Philippines, with masks first, right, and PPEs and oxygen. Now with the next phase is with the vaccines. Vietnam was largely omitted from the first, Chinese trips with donations. For one reason, Vietnam was doing pretty well with the pandemic last year, but also, it points to the existing tension between Vietnam and China. And now with the vaccines rollout, Vietnam did receive around 500,000 Sinopharm doses, but it stands in a huge contrast with Cambodia, for example, which is next door and much smaller population. And in last week, we had actually Cambodia coming to Vietnam to donate medical supplies. So it shows you that, certain geopolitical landscape going on there. That's one argument to put it. The other one is also in case of Indonesia. I think it was only China at the time that was able to really supply the quantity that Indonesia needs. Now we have more players now in the game, and US is also coming with new donations, and Australia has also been quite active in supplying their own support in terms of vaccination of the region, but also contributing to Gavi program. So there are a lot of actors there, but I think China and Russia, they do stand out in terms of the leading in terms of vaccine diplomacy. Now, US and others are also in the game, but I think it's quite dispersed, and it still goes to the vaccine club, the countries that are able to produce and have their own vaccines. So we are talking about the US, China, UK, and Germany. India was supposed to be one of the key actors, and that was important because the Quad partnership, the Quadrilateral Security partnership that had an idea of vaccine partnership, but it is complicated by India's situation and ability to produce vaccines. So what Richard mentioned about the efficacy of vaccines is one thing, but also I think at the moment, most of the countries, especially those that are experiencing big waves, are scrambling for any vaccines, and I think they, while they would want to, be able to pick and choose, there are situations and they can't afford, in terms of vaccine, discrimination, if you want to say that.
Certainly, it really is a case of sort of the fortunate and the not so fortunate, I think, still in terms of who can actually produce and circulate. Jay, can I just ask you, we've heard a bit about this concept of economic scarring from the pandemic. What are your views on that? Do we know a lot about it, or is it still sort of theory at the minute?
Right. Yes, I think this is where the discussion should focus on from here on, looking at the longer term impacts of the pandemic and what it would leave behind in its wake as we now start thinking about the new normal. Work that the World Bank has done, ADB as well, has suggested that decades of progress in reducing poverty is being reversed in just a few years of this pandemic, and there's this possibility of perpetuating an intergenerational cycle of poverty through the various inequalities that this pandemic has highlighted at one level and produced on the other. And this includes things like unequal access to new forms of learning or work and so on. Not everyone can look into a computer and earn a living like many of us can. So they've been, unequally impacted by the pandemic responses, which is the lockdowns. So I think the scarring is a real possibility. There are already early signs of it happening that we can pick up from the work of the multilaterals. And I suspect that this is, something that we will have to deal with for many, many years to come. A lot of the, Sustainable Development Goals as well, which were already not looking good before the pandemic, now look very unlikely to be realized going forward.
If we look across the region, Richard, Myanmar is the country that is sliding backwards the fastest. Could you perhaps just give us a brief recap of the situation there? We're hearing some terrible stories coming out in terms of, the doctors are in hiding. I mean, the military are hiding the oxygen. It's just a terrible situation. Perhaps if you could just fill us in a bit.
Yeah, look, it's dire, and tragic and very distressing, particularly because Myanmar did really incredibly well last year to keep the pandemic away, and even managed to keep its economy growing slowly, but just to keep it in the positive territory was a rare feat. And of course, the coup has smashed all that and has done so just as Delta has arrived. So it's a perfect storm. As you said, there's a very strong civil disobedience movement in Myanmar as well as protesting the coup. So many doctors and nurses won't work for the junta. The junta in turn is now hunting them, sometimes to death. So it's very frightening and dangerous for doctors. Most of them are trying to work underground, but they're putting their own lives literally on the line. The public health system just doesn't work. And the fledgling vaccination program that was really only just getting off the ground has now been hijacked by the junta, but has no trust from the population. Myanmar has very few vaccines. COVAX, which is the sort of global initiative to try and overcome inequitable distribution of vaccines, has stopped supplying into Myanmar. And the generals are now turning to Russia and China, but it's nowhere near what's needed. So in the meantime, we're seeing cases rise sharply. We're seeing those awful deaths that you're talking about, and also seeing that Myanmar, of course, is now exporting the virus as a kind of super spreader state, including into China. And Myanmar's, quite a big country population-wise, about 55 million people. So an absolute worst-case scenario here hardly bears thinking about. And really what's urgently needed is some kind of major international intervention. That's incredibly hard for a whole lot of reasons that we just don't have time to talk about here. But we are now starting to hear a few global voices call for this, including the Special Rapporteur on Myanmar just the other day. So something just has to be done to get more vaccines into the country and try and build a vaccination program and provide more oxygen and all the other things that Myanmar needs.
We did see at the ASEAN meeting that was held to discuss Myanmar, I think it was April from memory, Singapore and Indonesia in particular were both sort of pushing quite hard. And we came up with this 5-point plan, and since then it's been sort of crickets, nothing seems to have progressed. I guess now too, those countries amongst everyone else are very sort of consumed by their own pandemic situation. Huong, have I missed something? Has there been anything? Has the ASEAN progressed at all with its attempts to mediate in Myanmar?
Yes, we are seeing a very slow, if there's any progress. I mean, ASEAN is the first instance because it's a regional organization to which Myanmar belongs, but ASEAN is used to its ASEAN way, which is diplomacy and long-term negotiation. We had the Code of Conduct in South China Sea in negotiation and still in negotiation for 25 years. We don't have that time in the case of Myanmar, right? And everything in ASEAN structures takes time, and this is the urgency, it's humanitarian crisis on top of the pandemic, it's two in the same crisis. But this is a very, very delicate situation, and the traditional diplomatic means that ASEAN falls back to, it's not as effective. And there's still, we have 5-point consensus, as you mentioned, but there is no timeline to it in terms of implementation, any of them, including, even arriving with humanitarian assistance or appointing special envoy. We still haven't reached that, let alone, stopping the violence and hoping for more constructive steps on the side of the Tatmadaw. So I think it is a very difficult time to rely on traditional ASEAN mechanism, especially ASEAN works is through direct contact, consultation, negotiation, meetings, very close meetings, and leaders playing golf together, meeting together. But now the pandemic has prevented that, and online Zooms are not the best for delicate negotiation. That's one. But also, this generation of ASEAN leaders, we don't have the diplomats or statements and people who had that diplomatic charisma that once was in ASEAN, among ASEAN leaders. Leaders like Jokowi, Duterte, or Prayut, they have been less interested in ASEAN mechanism already for some time ago. So it's not the same caliber of the diplomats anymore for up to this task, on top of all other challenges around. So I think the chances that ASEAN will come up with something concrete and fast is slim. You mentioned Singapore is the top investor in Myanmar, has also commercial interest there, wants to fall back to engagement, constructive engagement, rather than sanctioning or isolating Myanmar. So there are different interests within ASEAN. The views on Myanmar crisis are different. So I think it's going to be a long negotiation process, but unfortunately in this case of crisis in Myanmar, we can't afford that time.
Yeah, it's just so terrible what's happening in that country. An Australian businessman I know who was hoping to get back said he weeps for Myanmar, and I think we all share a little bit of that feeling. Can I just encourage people watching out there to send in any questions for the panel? We do have a couple that have come up. We might turn to them now. Jay, I might hit you with this one. The Philippines has a BBB+ credit rating. Finch just put the country on credit watch. Other than economics, should the rate of vaccine take-up be included in assessing credit rating, which is an interesting idea?
Okay. Oh, wow. Well, that is a very interesting idea. And well, I guess in a sense, it is already being captured because, it's a proxy for long-term prospects of recovery, right? I mean, this is something that these sorts of rating agencies have to do, look forward and think about, what their, more immediate problems are, what the longer-term recovery prospects might be. If it's going to be included as an incentive to increase vaccination rates or reduce hesitancy, not too sure that the man on the street or the poor farmer in the province cares too much about these ratings directly. But yeah, so I think it's actually being captured. But yeah, so the vaccine hesitancy, I think the Philippines is a major issue. They've had this bad experience not long ago with the dengue vaccine, the Dengvaxia vaccine, where lots of children ended up being harmed by it, and so an already low level of trust in government has been further reduced as a result, particularly with respect to vaccines. And I think that's going to be a big challenge. But maybe the one good thing, if there can ever be a good thing coming out of this Delta super spreading variant, is a reduction in that hesitancy seeping in. People are now, beginning to see that they have to overcome their concerns because Delta is such an immediate and high risk factor for everyone. So maybe that will be a silver lining to this horrible new variant.
Well, we hope so. Another question has come in, Richard, that I might put to you in the first instance from Cameron Hill. Australia's assistance package for Southeast Asia was announced in late 2020, but Delta has changed the game. How should Australia's assistance to the region, particularly Indonesia, evolve as the pandemic and its impacts evolve?
Yeah, great question, because it gets to what more can we do, which I think really should be at the forefront of all policymakers' minds at the moment. So just very quickly, I think we've seen 3 stages of Australian assistance. The first was regearing of the existing aid program to meet COVID needs, with a particular emphasis on economic recovery. Then there was an additional package announced at towards the end of last year, quite a big one when you looked at it in dollar terms. That was particularly around responding urgently to urgent pandemic needs. So it was focused on vaccines, for example, and on other medical support. We've also seen the quadrilateral security dialogue announcement that Huang mentioned, which has promised 1 billion doses, probably not till 2022 though, because that relies on Indian domestic production. And Australia's got a kind of logistics role in that, but not a direct vaccine role. And then lastly, just in the past few weeks, Australia's announced some additional direct donations of vaccines. For example, they've donated 2.5 million AstraZeneca doses to Indonesia. There's AstraZeneca doses going to Vietnam and so on. And this is coming out of, a bit ironically, Australia's domestic surplus stocks of AstraZeneca vaccines, because we're making it now at the rate of about 1 million doses a week. So look, that's all, I think, good and credible. But what I would say is the scale of this disaster. Sorry, I just accidentally knocked my microphone. The scale of this disaster in Southeast Asia, to my mind, requires a kind of grandness to our thinking. And I still don't think we're quite there yet. And in the short term, I think we could hopefully, as we get more and more AstraZeneca, really scale up that response. But in the sort of medium to longer term, we have to be thinking about what do partnerships with Southeast Asia look like now that go to helping them recover and overcome the scarring that Jay talked about in that question. And I think there's a lot more work that can be done there.
Huong, would you like to add to Richard's point there, particularly about what nature those sort of long-term partnerships could take?
Yes, I spent a lot of time thinking about that long-term engagement and durable engagement. And I would agree with everything Richard said about the immediate public health crisis, and also what Jay suggested in terms of economic solutions to that. But in beyond the immediate crisis and beyond the COVID cases and responding to them in vaccines, I think there's also new already started, but the pandemic has really multiplied that, which is transition into the digital economy. A lot of Southeast Asian countries are in this digital transformation phase, and they really see it as a way out of the pandemic-induced economic difficulties. And they were on the way to do that anyway, because that's the natural progression. Southeast Asians are largely very young population and very tech savvy and very well connected. So that would be a natural sphere to develop. And here is where Australia can support Southeast Asian. I give you an example. During the pandemic, just this year, just 6 months of this year in Vietnam, there were noted around 70,000 new companies. Some of them are exclusively online, others not, but that shows you the scale of entrepreneurship and also creative thinking in terms of what to do with this traditional service economy or production manufacturing, moving it outside of that scope where obviously pandemic prevents their economic activities. So there are a lot of things that Australia can do in longer term in terms of assisting Southeast Asian digital transformation. Anything from really scale of digital literacy trainings to the vulnerable groups, or rescaling, upscaling people who had been in service our tourism industries, the ones that are most affected by COVID. Into the cyber security, cyber norms, and protection of critical infrastructure, something that Australia cares about deeply and is spending a lot of time and resources in upscaling their own, and therefore they can Australia can share the best practices and lessons learned in this process too. So this is something I think will really go a long way and in long term, connecting the two ecosystems.
Just keeping an eye on the time, and we are actually at 1:45, so I might hand over to Richard to wrap up, but just one, I guess, comment from me on the idea and perhaps what form assistance from Australia could take. I was talking to someone in Jakarta the other day, and there is a lot of angst and sadness about particularly the health workers who are dying even though they have been vaccinated with Sinovac. And we were talking about AstraZeneca and Australia's production. I didn't realise it was getting close to 1 million a day, but this person told me if Australia did something now, some big gesture, sorry, a week, it would, yeah, 1 million a week, sure. But this person said to me that if Australia did do something now, it would be remembered for a long time. So there is a real opportunity, I think. And as you mentioned, Huong, there's so many areas of possible cooperation that we could be talking to. I'm sure people are, but certainly I think time for some overt action, perhaps. And yeah, over to you, Richard.
Well, look, I would actually give the last word to Jay, because I think it might just be good to hear from Jay about what could be done, because of course with his ADB background, ADB spent a lot of time thinking about how to pull the region, up towards convergence with advanced economies. So for me, look, thank you everyone for participating. Great discussion, and thank you to our audience. But I'll give Jay the last word on what should we be doing.
Okay, thank you, Richard. Well, I'm no longer with ADB, so I can speak freely, I guess, now without getting into trouble. But yeah, so that's an interesting point I think you raised about, what can we take away from this crisis to try and create, a more equal or better world, especially in this region where most of the world's poor still live. It's difficult. I mean, our record with learning from crises is not a good one. We don't have to go back a long way to remind ourselves of the things that we say we'll do or start doing, how quickly they can be reversed once the good times arrive. Now we are still talking about build back better and everything else because we are still in this pandemic. But I think in the immediate adjustment period in the new normal, we have to be careful not to allow the backlash against globalization to take hold, which started before the pandemic, but has found new voice and new support because of the pandemic. And here, I mean, the retrenchment to look inward, protectionism has a new name every few years. Now it's called resilience sometimes, or reshoring. And all of this might have a hidden agenda. And we need to be wary of that. It comes in different guises. And so at a time where we will be needing more labor and capital mobility, which is, very soon, if not already, the pandemic might reduce it, the motivation to increase these sorts of flows. Trade in goods has remained remarkably strong, which is another good thing, but supply chains have been affected, and we need to ensure that, all traditional forms of protections don't rise. That's in the adjustment phase. And then the long term, we have to look at greater investments in social infrastructure, I guess, dealing with the big picture items like improving our education systems to produce more flexible workforces, especially with a more digitalized world, increasing the capacity of countries to raise capital at home, as there'll be less mobility for a while, I think, and finally dealing with climate change. So those will be the longer term challenges. But I hope this time our memories, our lessons learned will not fade away, and that we remember how we failed to learn before and the consequences are high. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Jay. That's quite a good note to finish the program. And thank you to Huong, Richard, and Emma for this very insightful and topical update. Thanks again to Australian ASEAN Council and Victorian Government, as well as all our members for supporting this project. as well as supporting our work at Asia Society Australia. Join our next public event on the 27th of July, very different topic, Chinese Communist Party at 100. We'll host a panel of experts to demystify the CCP, take a practical look at how the party works, how the membership works, its structure, and what benefits it brings to members. So I hope you can join us then, and keep an eye on our upcoming events, reports, and analysis. So thanks again for joining us today. Please stay safe, and we'll see you next time.